So we are addressing the question, what kind of church do we need to be? And we are looking at a particular church that we read about in the book of Acts. So I hope you brought your New Testament this morning, and if you did, you may be turning to Acts chapter 11, and we're going to resume looking at that church in just a moment. This past week, I was really interested to discover some brand new information from Sam Rainer, who runs the Church Answers Research Group. This is dated September 18th. I mean, brand new research, hot off the press, just this past week. And he addresses this question about how do the unchurched really feel about the American church. Well, I was really excited to open up this link and to read Rainer's report because it's falling right in line with this theme that we are discussing from the pulpit on Sunday mornings. And I'm not going to share everything that Rainer shares in this report. If you're interested, just Google Sam Rainer, and I'm sure it'll pop up. But I want to share 5 things that I found especially interesting and very challenging for us as we strive to answer this question, what kind of church do we need to be? Number 1, the unchurched struggle to connect with the churches in their own communities. Now, Rainer doesn't go into a lot of discussion as to why, but at least makes the point, or the suggestion is made, there is an element of the unchurched that want to connect with a church in their community. Number 2, the unchurched believe churches are still relevant, but not trustworthy. So we have a reputation or an image problem evidently out there. The unchurched wants to see the relevance of us, but they're not sure they can trust us. Number 3, the unchurched don't attend mainly because of indifference, not viewing church as necessary, or they simply got out of the habit of going. So again, it's just an apathy kind of thing, which should challenge us to maybe be a little, can I use the word aggressive, in seeking out the unchurched. Number 4, the unchurched are open to friendships through church, but are intimidated to visit because they don't feel welcome. And so one thing that we should take very seriously is when we do have a guest, not only being friendly, but being as welcoming as we can be. Like applauding for them when their football team wins. But we need to think about those kinds of things. And I would argue that maybe there's a difference between just being friendly and really being welcoming. All right? And then finally, number 5, the unchurched start attending to grow spiritually and because someone invited them. In fact, nearly 80% of unchurched persons would come to church if they were invited by a friend who also accompanied them to a worship service. One of the characteristics that we saw last week in the first century church that we are examining in this series was very evangelistic. They were willing to invite their family, willing to invite their friends, to consider this Jesus that they had become so obsessed with. So there are 5 things that Rainer learned about unchurched people that I think can challenge us as we think about what kind of church do we need to be. So, if you've been here the past couple of weeks, you know that we are looking at the church in ancient Antioch. And we read about them primarily in 3 chapters in the book of Acts, chapter 11, chapter 13, and chapter 15. Last week, we saw 3 characteristics from chapter 11. We're going to look at 3 more characteristics from chapter 11 this morning. And then next week, we'll conclude this series of lessons by seeing 3 characteristics from chapters 13 and 15. So very quickly, last week, here are the 3 characteristics we saw. They were varied in membership. The church in Antioch found itself located in a very diverse culture in that ancient city. And we can see implications from the text that the church as well was very diverse. And so they seemed to embrace that diversity. All were welcome, whether race, ethnicity, culture background, economic background, gifted background, they were all together. Number 2, we also saw, as I mentioned, they were very powerful in evangelism. Evidently, the Christians there were willing to share their faith very boldly and very confidently. And then the 3rd characteristic from chapter 11, verse 23 that we notice, really that interesting statement when the church in Jerusalem sent Barnabas up to Antioch to investigate Gentiles accepting Jesus. Luke tells us that Barnabas saw evidence of God's grace. And so we were challenged last week to think about when people visit us, do they see evidence of God's grace among us? So 3 more characteristics this morning, and we're going to focus in chapter 11, verses 25 and following. And the first characteristic we see in verses 25 and the first portion of verse 26, they were nurturing in the word. Look at verse 25. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul, of course, who later became Paul, for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers. We'll see later, when we get to chapters 13 and 15 next week, this emphasis in the church in Antioch upon the Word, teaching the Word, learning the Word. To nurture is to care for and encourage the growth or development of someone. Nurturing in the Word will characterize a church determined to educate and equip its members to effectively withstand the temptations of culture. So when we think about this, I want to remind us of 3 important things. Things that we've covered in the past, things that we all know, but things I think it's good to remind ourselves of. Think first of all of the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28. You can quote that verse. Jesus says to go and make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. All right? The point has been made. The imperative, the command in the Great Commission is to make disciples, to make disciples. The other 3 words, which take on the essence of a command, are going, baptizing, and teaching. And so for this point this morning, I want to emphasize the teaching part. Okay? We typically go somewhere every day. So we do that part. And I think we're pretty good at initially introducing people to Jesus and baptizing them. I think the order here is intentional. We can't forget about people after we baptize them. We got to continue to teach. We got to continue to nurture in the Word. All right? So let's not forget that aspect of the Great Commission. The second verse, again, we've spent a lot of time in this verse through the years, is in Acts chapter 2. In Acts chapter 2, verses 41 through 47, we have Luke's first summation of the spread of Christianity in the book of Acts. And he tells us that they devoted themselves, that is, the Christians in Jerusalem. They devoted themselves, first of all, first priority. What? Do you remember? The apostles' teaching. The word that's translated devoted themselves there is a very strong word. I mean, they were exerting a lot of time, a lot of attention, and a lot of energy to teaching, spending time in the apostles' doctrine. So again, we see this emphasis upon nurturing one another in the Word of God. And then the third reminder is simply the basic definition of a disciple, a mathetes. A disciple is a student. A disciple is a learner. A disciple is an apprentice. And so one of the first and foremost things as a follower of Jesus is to learn from His Word. And we see the church in Antioch exemplifying that for us. The apostles and the first century church did more than simply make converts. They made disciples. William Willimon of Duke University, in his commentary on Acts, summarizes this section of Acts about Antioch this way. He writes, if it is really true, and I would add it is, that the church is a counterculture phenomenon, that the truth of Christ comes to us from without, that being a Christian is against our natural inclination, then the church ignores the teaching office on peril of losing its soul. Nurturing in the Word. And so as we have opportunity to be nurtured in the Word, I would encourage us to take advantage of those opportunities. But we'll get to that in our first takeaway if we ever get to the end of this thing. All right? Number two this morning. Look at the rest of verse 26. Barnabas and Saul went to Tarsus, Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. When he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church, taught great numbers. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. Now let's spend a couple of minutes unpacking this a little bit. The word Christian is a compound word which is composed of the Greek word for Christ, Christos, which means Messiah or anointed one or king, combining Christos with a little Latin suffix, IAN, which could be attached to nouns denoting one who engages in, practices, or works with the referent of the base noun, like a comedian practices comedy. A theologian practices and studies theology. Or this little suffix can be attached to a proper noun, as it is with Christ, which denotes a proponent of, a partisan of, or belonging to. So anyone who wears the name Christian is claiming to be a proponent of, a partisan of, or belonging to Christ. Right? What's interesting, at least to me, is this word occurs in the New Testament only here and in Acts 26:28 by the non-Christian Agrippa, and in 1 Peter 4 and verse 6 by persecutors of Christians. Right? So these two occurrences, and the verb that Luke uses here to be called in Acts 11, suggest, and scholarship generally is in agreement with this, that the designation Christian was coined by Greek outsiders. Jews would not have given this name because they did not accept Jesus as the Christ. But evidently, fellow Greeks in this city of Antioch must have heard the disciples speak so often of Christ that they supplied a suffix to the word Christ, thus Christians, meaning, again, something like the Christ people, the Christ group, those who are talking about, who are making Christ known. So it's interesting that these Christians were living their lives in such a way in their community and in their culture that they could be identified as being different, distinct. Right? So this early usage in Acts, I think, indicates two things. It is the type of term Gentiles would have used reflecting the success of Antioch's Gentile mission. Gentiles were dubbing their fellow Christians who became followers of Christ as Christians, this Christ group. And secondly, it demonstrates that Christianity was beginning to have an identity of its own. They were no longer viewed as just a part of Judaism. People were beginning to recognize, no, there's something else going on here. This is not just Jews and Judaism. Right? So our identity is the fact of being who or what we are. Identity is a really big thing right now, isn't it? Right? It involves the characteristics determining who or what we are. And I want to suggest this morning, based on this verse, that these Christians in Antioch had a clear sense of who they were. Now think about just for a moment how we identify ourselves. Well, we have names, we have addresses, we have jobs, we may have a political persuasion. We have certain teams we like to follow, and we dress appropriately. You know. And all these ways of identifying ourselves, Jesus must determine first and foremost who we are and what we are. And even though we may be a little confused politically, maybe we might be, as a student, a little confused as to what to major in. Maybe we may be a little confused as to what route to go in a job or with our family. But as we wrestle with some of those decisions, and maybe even struggle with some of those identities, remember, we wear the name of Christ. And Christ is who we belong to. Number 3, verses 27 through 29, we see an example from this church in Antioch. They were generous in benevolent giving. Luke tells us during this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. So, not only would that include Jerusalem, that also would include Antioch. Then we have this little parenthetical statement. It can be historically verified. This happened during the reign of Claudius. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. This they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. Let me read this verse in 3 other translations. It's really good to look at various translations, I think, in a verse like this, just to kind of get a better understanding of what I think Luke is trying to tell us. First, from the Common English Bible, the disciples decided they would send support to the brothers and sisters in Judea, with everyone contributing to this ministry according to each person's abundance. From the Easy to Read translation, the believers in Antioch wanted to help the other believers who lived in Judea. Each of them decided how much of their own money they could give. And then finally, ISV, International Standard Version. So all the disciples decided they would send a contribution to the brothers living in Judea as they were able. This story, this example, suggests 6 steps in what these Christians went through in giving of themselves in a very generous, benevolent way, remembering again that Antioch would be affected by this severe famine. They were going to face some hard times as well, but it did not keep them from sacrificially giving to support their brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. Step number 1, there was a recognition of a need. Agabus stood up and says there's going to be a severe famine. There was a need. Number 2, there was some introspection here. Luke tells us that they looked within themselves as each one was able. The word translated able there is a compound word which means good doing, good work. All right. Number 3, there was determination. Luke tells us they decided. They then provided help. The word help is the word ministry. All right. There was a sense of brotherhood, brothers and sisters. I like the way Scott McKnight translates this word. Siblings. We're family. We're brothers and sisters. All right. That's why, as I've said before in a sermon from this pulpit, we need to recover that old thing that used to be very prevalent in churches of Christ, referring to each other as brother and sister. All right? Brother so-and-so, sister so-and-so. We're family. All right? And the Christians in Antioch recognized that about the Christians in Jerusalem, family that they would never see probably, would never know firsthand. It's doubtful that those brethren, unless they sent a letter back, would ever have an opportunity, at least face to face, to say thank you to those Christians in Antioch. But then number 6, and this maybe is the most important one, there was follow through. Luke says, this they did. You know, we talk a lot at times, and we plan a lot, and we program a lot. Do we actually follow through and do what we need to do? So these 3 characteristics from the rest of chapter 11 here about Antioch as we seek to answer this question, what kind of church do we need to be? Looking to Antioch as an example, nurturing in the Word, having a clear sense of identity, and generous in benevolent giving. So, 3 takeaways from each of those points, okay? Number 1, I've already mentioned this, but take advantage of opportunities to be nurtured in the Word. And we do our best here as a staff and as a leadership team to provide those opportunities. There's an opportunity at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. There's an opportunity on Wednesday nights at 6:30. There's an opportunity, there are a few of us who get together on Monday afternoon at 1 o'clock. There are other opportunities in life groups and other small groups to come together with fellow brothers and sisters and be nurtured in the Word. Take advantage of those times. Secondly, again for emphasis, identify first and foremost as a Christian. Wouldn't that just blow people away if when you're asked, what do? You said, well, I'm a Christian. What's your name? Well, I'm a Christian. Now, that'd probably get a little weird when they see this big group of people and we all have the first name of Christian. But, where's your address? What's your address? Well, I'm a Christian. Just have some fun with that. All right? One very, very powerful way, I think, to make Jesus known, simply by identifying primarily as a Christian. And then number 3, and not to, I don't want anyone to feel like they would be bragging or anything like that, all right? But have some fun with this, and if you actually do it, share it, all right? Because I'd like to share it. Give something away this week in the name of Christ. Give something away this week in the name of Christ. When I left, Lori and I, she came with me, when we left Paris, Texas, and we were beginning to pack and put things together, this is embarrassing, all right? But I had 12 bait casting rods and reels. I really only needed, I needed 2. You got to have one for worm fishing. You got to have one for crankbaits. Right, Dane? I mean, at least 2. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you how many Dane has. Right? But, so I thought, I don't need 12 rods and reels. So, at a very weak moment in one of my final sermons, I said, I've got 3 to give away. I know. Big sacrifice. Well, do the math. That's 25%. That's pretty good. It's more than a tithe. 10%. So I had 3 young men come up and take me up on it. So there are 3 young guys in Lamar County, Texas, that have some pretty nice bait casting rod and reels. But I had some fun with that. Just give something away this week, but do it in the name of Christ. Darrell Bock, well-respected New Testament scholar, he concludes his commentary on Acts, this section, this way. In sum, we see the emergence of another key community engaged in mission, instruction, discipleship, and caring for other communities in need. Word and deed, again, are side by side. The summary could hardly do a better job of showing a vibrant church at work, performing the essential task of a community so visibly that outsiders note who its members are. As always, it is responsiveness to divine direction and vision that leads to its effective ministry. My prayer is, as we conclude our look at the church in ancient Antioch next week, that we can make some application here at Alameda, where the unchurched of our community not only see our relevance, but also can come to trust us. And maybe as we have opportunity to invite one of them to attend with us, that they will find us welcoming. And relationships can be built and developed. And we can make Jesus known in their lives.